when one looks at the history of FiDi, one can trace it back to the beginning days of New York City when Henry Hudson came over and first really, as we say in the New World, discovered New York City when it was called New Amsterdam. The history itself is really extraordinary, and it's a vast history, and it's a fascinating history. The first settlers of Manhattan came into New Amsterdam, now known as New York, in the FiDi area, and it really has not lost its essence since that time. Thomas Jefferson was the person that basically came up with the grid system, where streets would function and work perpendicular to one another. And in New York City, as the balance of New York City got developed, it is the ultimate quintessential grid system. Streets are labeled, you know, First Avenue, Second Avenue, Third Avenue, etc. And the streets are all labeled numerically up and get higher as one goes northward. It is a perfect grid system on a mathematical plane, bisected by a couple angled streets. Broadway being one of the streets that goes on a perfect north-south basis and goes from the point top of Manhattan to the lower part of Manhattan on a north-south basis, where everything else is on a grid on a perpendicular basis to one another, but for that one street, except for Lower Manhattan, except for specifically FiDi. The streets turn and curve in unique ways. There is no real true grid system. The streets aren't labeled through numbers, but they are labeled through names: Wall Street, Broad Street, Trinity, etc. And it is a unique place unto itself in all of New York City. And how did that happen? It happened because during the days when New Amsterdam, now New York, was founded, people didn't have automobiles. They didn't have the grid system. What did they do? They walked. So as they walked on these footpaths, people don't walk in perfect grids. They walk on angles, or they walk around rivers, or they walk over ravines. And that is how these streets developed in Lower Manhattan, and specifically FiDi. They developed through a walking pattern. And these were originally, in fact, Indian footpaths. So they wound themselves around, as do the streets. And they tend to be a little bit narrower because as they grew from footpaths to accommodate horse and buggies and ultimately automobiles, they did grow wider. But as the buildings already were being built, planned, and developed, you couldn't necessarily change and knock down buildings to make streets open and wider, where in the country of Midtown, you know, the country area where there were fields and orchards, when you laid the grid system on that Thomas Jefferson developed, you could lay it with wide open streets and redevelop the area because it was a new area. This was so old that it developed in an entirely different way than the rest of New York City. And hence it has an incredible history and a very, very rich history. And it's fascinating. And now, when one looks at what happened over the time in history, we really actually see that a lot of the history repeated itself. In the 1800s, I think in the late 1830s, New York City, which really comprised of FiDi at the time, went through a big, big fire, and over 100 buildings burned down. And the world said New York will never be able to rebuild. FiDi will never come back. Of course, it wasn't called FiDi at the time, but that destruction was so vast and so large that people were going to abandon the area and move northward and go build into another city. Well, New Yorkers don't do that. We don't have a history of that. What did they do? We rebuilt better, bigger, and more graciously than ever. And the history did, again, repeat itself in a tragic way on September 11th in 2001 when the terrorists attacked Lower Manhattan. And what did we do at that time? We did something similar to what happened in the 1830s when the city burned down. We rebuilt, but we did it better. We planned it more logically, and we made huge, vast improvements, all for the future. One of the things that were done was that every single underground pipe for electric, for water, the water mains, and all the telecommunications pipes south of Chambers Street. So all the FiDi, the World Financial Center, the World Trade Center area, and what we call the Greenwich Street South area, all of those areas, every single pipe underground has been replaced now. I think the last piping will be replaced in this August 2011. So you have an entire brand new infrastructure underground, on top of which you now have a completely redeveloped area, starting with the World Trade Center. The memorial, as I said, is opening up this September 11th of 2011. The buildings are under construction. Number one, World Trade Center, which will be the tallest building in the northern hemisphere at 1,776 feet high, will be now the home headquarters to Condé Nast, who just signed a 1 million square foot lease. That building is 3.1 million square feet. It's now 70% leased. And as of yesterday, it just hit the 70th floor. So June 6th, it hit the 70th floor on its way up to over 102 stories, plus the spire that's on top that will take it to 1,776 feet high. The number 4 World Trade Center is under construction. As of yesterday, it was on the 26th floor, and that building is over 60% leased. And it's a 2.1 million square foot building designed by the Japanese architect Maki, which is an extraordinary building. Number 3 World Trade Center is rising out of the ground right now and is continuing. All the steel has been purchased for that building. And number 2 World Trade Center is still in the ground, coming up, and it will be built up to street level. It won't continue until a tenant is signed for that. But again, all of the development will be there, and the Calatrava Path Station is under construction. In addition to which, also the World Trade Center, the museum is now just completing. It won't formally open its doors for another year because it needs to be fully developed and all the artifacts and things put into the museum, and they'll need a year for that when the building itself is constructed. But that will be clearly seen as a finished product from the outside. So that whole area is been redeveloped, which is really a repeat of the tragedy of the 1830s and the fire that occurred in FiDi at the time. So that the history is just an extraordinary place, and it is something that New Yorkers do. We rebuild from tragedy and do things even better and stronger than before. And to be a part of this in this day and age, in this time, and the history that's being made is really an extraordinary opportunity.